Good evening, good morning. Welcome to week 4 of PSHS 6240, Political Violence and Terrorism here at George Washington University. I want to just start off with announcements. Adobe Connect session we had on Thursday. I want to apologize again for those who attended, and there was some technology issues. I think we got them squared away in the first few minutes. But I want to thank the Group 1. They did an excellent job, well prepared, well briefed, good information. So I just want to again reach out to them and just say, hey, good job to them, as well as they've set the example. So if you are in a following group and you didn't see their presentation, I highly recommend you talk to them, take a look at what they did, just to get an idea of structure and PowerPoint slides and those types of issues. For whenever the following groups go. Don't forget the next one is 2 weeks from or last Thursday. I can't remember the date off the top of my head right now, but we're having one again every 2 weeks. And as a reminder, they're optional if you're not briefing, required if you are briefing. And I also want to say I'm flexible. For instance, for your group, if someone can't make it or can't brief or they're technologically impaired or they're in a different time zone, that's fine. They don't have to be there. Just it's up to the group to make sure that one person's briefing, two people are briefing, and then that they're there, and then to split up the work how you see fit. So I want to make that clear at the onset. Paper one is due. I'm taping this on a Saturday, Sunday, 11:59 p.m. Paper is due. And if you're on the West Coast or on a different time zone, I'll give you the extra 3 hours, but 11:59 is when I want to see it uploaded for on the East Coast. DC session. Some of you are in the DC area, and some of you might just benefit from stopping in on a class in the Arlington campus. I teach both online and in person, and there's advantages of online. There's some disadvantages as well. So I would highly recommend, obviously for not this class, but for future classes, maybe just talking to the professor and seeing if you can just sit in on the DC session. Might not be a bad idea and might open your eyes a little bit. And finally, current events. I'm taping this now. There's been a lot of executive orders pushed out this past week that are related to terrorism. What I will say is, well, a couple of things. What I'll say is there is a legitimate reason to worry about things like visa overstays or tracking people who are not U.S. citizens who are coming into our country for an extended period of time. There is importance to know that, okay, if you're here on a travel visa, you travel back one day and then you go back the next day. If you're on a student visa, that you're enrolled in school and you're doing the things. If you're on a work visa, that you're involved, gainfully employed. We do have a problem when those people kind of slip through the cracks, when they're here on vacation and then they overstay, or they're here on student visa and they're past their graduation date. So that is worthy of scrutiny and is something that would be a great final paper if you want to write on. However, the one thing I just want to say is in this field, as I mentioned in class, in the first class, sometimes we do what feels right or what appeases our feelings, but doesn't solve the problem. And I don't want to sound too political, but one of the things you learn in this class is to actually be able to address issues of terrorism and domestic security with analytical rigor. And I would ask that any of these executive orders, whether it's dealing with border walls, whether it's blocking refugees from the countries that it happened, or blocking refugees or blocking people from traveling here who might have legitimate visas, just ask yourself, are we doing it because it feels good, or does it satisfy the analytical rigor test? And that's, to quote Forrest Gump, that's all I'll say about that. So, review of week 3, Road to 9/11, excellent documentary. You will, I think we had good discussions on it on the discussion board. The question I have is close versus short term. When we look at the road to 9/11 and we look at the anger that was palpable in many Arab countries during 9/11. Was that because of political dysfunction that goes back to the Crusades, that goes back to the First World War, or was it something a little bit more modern? And I think you have two arguments there. You have the documentary Road to 9/11 that starts again with the Crusades, starts with the Mandate period after the First World War. And then on the other hand, you have the Zakaria article that I signed that says, well, you could look back in all those histories, but it really starts after the 6-Day War. And his argument is the world modernized. Eastern Europe modernized, South Africa modernized, the Eastern Pacific modernized, but the Arab states did not. And so I asked the question, when we look at 9/11 and we look at those issues, do we have to go back in history? How far in history do we have to go back? Do we have to go back to the Crusades, back to the Wahhabists in the 18th century? Do we have to go back to World War I? Or do we have to look at kind of the near term, those factors, the 6-Day War, the Islamic Revolution in Iran, the Afghanistan conflict in the Soviet Union, the lack of modernization, the Gulf War, all those kind of fed into the road to 9/11. And I think you'll have to be familiar with that. Hint, hint, hint for the exam. So again, I'm stomping my foot right now. Big hint on what's on the exam. The one thing I'll also say is I think it's a great quote about Saudi Arabia. Now that we're talking about Saudi Arabia, and they weren't on the ban list, but people were recommending it. But Saudi Arabia, the great quote was, that's the first confluence of radical Islam with oil. And it was as if the Ku Klux Klan were able to take the Texas oil fields. And I think that's a very quote that resonated with me as we go forward. And then Terrorism Finance, ISIS comparisons. I think another quote that resonated with me was from the Napolini. And I know she's a little anti-American. When she taped her lecture, it was 2006, height of the Iraq War, and there's a lot of, I don't want to say anti-Americanism, but in Europe it was, the United States didn't have the best reputation. But I want you to, the quote that comes from there is, terrorists are people that raise money that occasionally kill people. And I think that's very accurate when we're talking about, again, the ISIS documentary, or we're talking about ISIS right now. And again, the decline in ISIS's capacity can be traced to their lack of the targeting of their financial resources. And I think that's very true, and it goes in both ways. ISIS's rise can be explained by their ability to capture and exploit money, banking, taxation on oil, and then their downfall will result from targeting those facets. So as we study ISIS next week, just keep that in mind. So preview of week 4. Two things to talk about: terrorism adaptation. The readings, there's the RAND article and the ISIS documentary on PBS Frontline. Great documentary. And what you're going to look at is, so for the RAND article, there's 5 groups. There's Jemaah Islamiyah, Hezbollah, Provisional IRA, Shinrikyo, and the Earth Liberation Front. Choose one of those groups, whatever interests you, and read in depth on that group. So the RAND article's 150 pages. Don't read the whole thing. Just kind of get the intro and then go in depth on one of those groups that I mentioned and become very familiar with it. And your discussion section will be, okay, compare and contrast that group that you choose to ISIS. And again, there's cycles in terrorism on how they adapt, on how they respond, or how they flourish, and how they respond to counterterrorism pressure. That's what our lecture and discussion is going to be for terrorism adaptation. And again, there's certain groups, Hezbollah, Hamas, that are going strong 30 years later. There's other groups, Sikh separatism, Shinrikyo, I suspect ISIS as well, that are relegated to the dustbin of history. What makes a group successful? What makes a group fail? That's the question we'll be looking at, that I want in the back of your head when you're going through this week's readings. And then the second part is WMD. So Terrorism Adaptation is the first part, then WMD Terrorism is the second one. And I give this section because as I'm getting older and my cohorts are getting younger, people don't remember the run-up to the Iraq War in 2003. People don't remember that that really drove us into Iraq in 2002, 2003 timeframe was the fear of WMD, the fear that terrorists would get a hold of WMD, possibly from the Iraqi regime, and they would give this to, and then they would conduct a 9/11 times 1,000. That was the nightmare scenario that that was so worrisome, and I think that's what drove public opinion to invade Iraq. And I think that was a mistake. There are a lot of reasons you could look back on, but I think most people would say that if we could do it over again, we wouldn't invade Iraq. So I always said if I was in a position to influence people to have a better understanding of weapons of mass destruction, I would. And I think, again, we went into Iraq because the government, policymakers, intelligence community, media, and the general public didn't have an understanding of these weapons, didn't understand understanding of how they could or couldn't be used, and what their actual capabilities were. And that's why this segment is there. So the readings, the CNAS Om Shinrikyo article, excellent article. And it explains the logic behind Om Shinrikyo's 1995 sarin attack in Tokyo. Second thing is I'm going to assign a movie. I was hesitant about this because this is a graduate program, but I think the movie is really good. It is the HBO Dirty War, and it is now available online on YouTube. It's the HBO Dirty War. There's another documentary out there called Dirty War. That's not what I'm looking for. I'm looking for the HBO movie on Dirty War. So the lecture will cover Om Shinrikyo.
I can't find the answer to the question I heard.
Oh, sorry. I think Om Shinrikyo set off my Amazon Echo. That's kind of funny. A lecture will be about WMD terrorism, and the discussion will be the simple question: why Om Shinrikyo was able to muster the resources to conduct a WMD attack against civilians while Al-Qaeda was not. And again, watch the videos that are in the hyperlinked in the lectures, and you'll have a better understanding of Om Shinrikyo as well. So I look forward to, again, your papers. I look forward to discussions this week. And if there's any questions or issues, please let me know.